Thank you very much, Rachel, and it's a great honor and pleasure to join this distinguished panel and talk about issues on sustainability. I'm a power engineer by training, so what I'll be presenting to you in the next 30 minutes or so is some of the very recent work that we did that is focusing on how could we help the broader dialogue about energy climate transition. And that particular approach that we are trying to emphasize is a data-driven, cross-domain, open source approach. And hopefully, in the next 30 minutes or so, we'll convey to you some of the unique value propositions of it. And we very much look forward to having some dialogue with you all. And, I would like to acknowledge a broad set of collaborators, both at Texas A&M and at MIT, at Tsinghua University, as well as Breakthrough Energy, which we collaborated on these projects. So I'm going to first spend very brief few minutes talking about the major transition in the electricity sector and why do we care about the electricity sector in particular when extreme events hit. And then I'm going to talk about two specific recent papers that we just got published hot off the press on impact of COVID on electricity sector, as well as how do we analyze the very recent February 2021 Texas outage. And I'll draw some concluding remarks. So I think we all, people on this audience, are fully aware of why we are here today. We are here today because we care about, the sustainable future. And if anybody wants to take, any leadership role in, abating the greenhouse gas emissions, one has to look at the top, emitting sectors. And here in the US, it's electricity and transportation. And in most other industrialized countries, it's pretty much the same. So any kind of approach to address these climate challenges, one needs to take care of the top sectors. And it seems to me that there seems to be some sort of a consensus these days, which is maybe a critical path towards that carbon neutrality is number one, let's get in as many clean energy sources as possible onto the electricity sector. And number two, let's burn the electrons to run the power the cars and trucks so that they are coming from these cleaner sources. That sort of seems to be the consensus in both in the US and around the world. But one question we would like to sort of suggest is that, is the grid and in general, is the infrastructure ready for that? And our opinion is that perhaps it's far from being ready for that. And I'll elaborate why throughout the talk. But this is just sort of a couple of very recent papers and commentaries we just published with some collaborator. One just appeared a couple of weeks ago at the Jewel, and the other is a op-ed, companion op-ed that appears at the Hill. And so, one really needs to have a much more holistic view of the critical role of the grid and energy systems in supporting this climate transition. And this is sort of where we have been spending a lot of our efforts on over the past decade or so, which is trying to advance the technological base for modernizing the grid. And that technology base includes advanced computing, advanced hardware, as well as cyber physical security and power electronics. But then we cannot stop there. One has to make the value proposition and data analytics that would benefit various different stakeholders. And that is not enough. One has to, again, go to the policy level because of the complex nature of this industry, and then really articulate these technological and economic advances in the view of policy making. And this is sort of our view of how future energy system research how to evolve. And what we will be presenting to you today are some of the specific building blocks at the technological base. So, what are some of the specific research challenges? I think there are a lot of them, but let me just elaborate three of them. One, how do we ensure the cyber and physical security in the future energy grid with massive amount of edge-level distributed resources, as we just heard from the previous talk? Two, how do we design a market and procurement of flexibility in a carbon-free or carbon-neutral power system? Because a lot of the sources are going to be highly, highly variable. And three, the grid actually works usually okay under normal situations, but it really is under lots of stress under the extreme conditions. So one that has to spend much more emphasis and time worrying about those extreme conditions, the ones that we just saw in the past couple of years, right? So that's what we're going to be focusing on today. And I want to elaborate how we can together make some difference in this area. So I'm going to show you two specific case studies. One has to do with understanding the impact of COVID, at least the first part of COVID, on the US electricity sector. And the second one has to do with how do we provide quantitative data-driven approach to analyzing this very hotly debated February outage that is close to my house. And then the overall theme is this cross-domain data-driven framework. And I'll elaborate that as we go, okay? So before any math, let's show some visual impacts. This is the NASA's nighttime image at the city of New York, the beautiful city of New York. And what they do is they take this midnight lighting images on the city. And then we did some signal processing and we removed some of the ambient lighting situations. So what you see here is basically the lighting and human generated activities. On the left is on February the 8th, 2020. And on the right is at the first wave of COVID around April 25th. I was literally shocked when I first saw this figure because there was a dramatic reduction of the brightness of the city. The city got dimmed down by 40%, right? And that, visual effect is a very, direct impression of how COVID has affected everybody's life, which was reflected through the use of lighting, which is, of course, using electricity, right? And that kind of really motivated us at the height of the first lockdown, last April and March. All the students and collaborators, we were all staying at home, and we say, we can't develop the vaccine. What could we do? We want to help. So we said maybe we could help analyzing the electricity sectors, how that gets affected by COVID. So that's how we got started. And then, here's a more of a electricity viewpoint in terms of the consumption, right? So you could see that there's some dramatic changes. But then, we want to go maybe a little bit deeper and then understand what exactly was going on. So we said, let's do something. Let's create this open access data hub. So everybody welcome to go and download and check out this GitHub, in which, to our best knowledge, is perhaps the first of its kind, which combine the usual kind of electricity data sets together with some unusual data sets, such as public health data sets. We are fetching this from the Johns Hopkins COVID cases data, such as mobility data sets. We got this SafeGraph partnership, which gave us, hundreds of millions of mobile devices data in the US, such as the NASA's nighttime image data, which gave us some visual impact and understanding of what was going on during nighttime, as well as the weather data. And then we combine them, we clean them, we create the architecture to merge them, and we are still updating the data set, on a daily basis as we speak. And that hopefully, becomes a platform and enabling a data hub for many more follow-up work that they can draw some data-driven insights on what was going on. So, there are some papers, very recent paper and some featured articles about it. And so let's get into some of the meat of it. So the first thing we want to understand is very basic, right? How does COVID affect the electricity consumption, right? So many of you are economists by training or econometricians by training. So you probably would very naturally do that by looking at not the data from 2020 and compare with the previous year's data, right? Rather, one should do the following, which is you should compare the actual consumption during the COVID time and compare that against something called counterfactual, right? So counterfactual basically means for the same time, if it weren't for COVID, what could have been the electricity consumption during that time, right? In other words, the baseline model, right? So that will be the first step, is to create a robust baseline model that will allow you to understand the counterfactual, and then you can extract the difference, and then trying to understand how does that difference came about and what are the causing factors for that. So we did exactly that, building thanks to the data hub we built. And then we create this deep neural nets-based ensemble backcast model, which trains about 800 different models with 20 plus minus 20% fluctuation of the hidden cell numbers. And then we select the top ones with the highest estimation accuracy. And then we validated for the first couple of months. That was right before COVID hit the US, right? And that gave us some reasonable satisfaction in terms of accuracy. And then off we go. So I want you to look at these figures. These are the electricity consumption in the city of New York before and during the first COVID hit. So, you know, you might have thought that the difference between the consumption of 2020, which is a blue curve, and the electricity consumption in 2019, which is the orange curve, you might have just attributed that difference as the difference caused by COVID, but that may not be the best idea, right? Instead, what you should be looking at is you should try to compare the blue curve, which is the actual consumption during 2020, with the gray curve, which is this backcast estimation, namely these counterfactual values, right? So as you could see, the counterfactual value on the second figure on the left, on March 2nd, actually is very much mimicking the blue curve, which actually gave you some sense of confidence, that meaning that the baseline is actually doing the right thing. And then when the COVID hit, as you could see in the second, the third and fourth figures, there's a very visible difference. And that difference between the gray curve and the blue curve is indeed attributable towards what impact of COVID is, right? So we did that not only for New York, we did that across the country, right? We did that not only for the cities, we did that for all the major so-called RTOs. That's our lingo of regional transmission organization. Places like ERCOT, it's covering Texas. Places like ISO New England, it's covering the New England 6 states, and so on and so forth. So long story short, you see a very visible difference during that first few months of COVID around the country, and especially in those major cities. And in the New York, you see as high as like 15% of reduction, right? So that's actually quite noticeable differences. So then the next very natural question is, what is the way to kind of explain that, right? Or how could we attribute different factors in causing such changes, right? Of course, we know the big elephant in the room was COVID, but exactly what, why, right? So we turn to this cross-domain data set. This is something, it's pretty, takes some time to analyze and visualize, but after you visualize, it's pretty cool. This is the percentage of people who are completely staying at home in America during this time. So this is generated from the SafeGraph data set. And you can see over the first couple of months of COVID, the percentage of people staying at home grew quite substantially. And then here's some other more static snapshot, which gave you a better kind of a view of the exact change over time, right? So these are all the Wednesdays, right? So people are, was really doing social distancing and staying at home, complete staying at home. And here's another viewpoint, again, enabled by these cross-domain data sets. We were, if you recall last year, everybody was talking about social distancing and stay home and lockdown. So, but all these connotations, all these words actually have very different implications as far as the change of mobility is concerned. And I want to draw your attention to these two curves, for example. The curve of the population of on-site workers, the third curve, and also the curve of mobility in the retail sector. Now, both are, roughly referring to the very broad concept of social distancing, right? You want people to separate away from each other. You don't want them to go to work. You want them to stay at home, and so on and so forth. But data is actually telling you some very interesting and contrasting patterns. When it comes to population of on-site workers, you can see there was sort of a almost constant behavior, and then all the way until March 15, of 2020. And guess what? If you remember what happened in March 15 last year, that was when the national emergency was declared and everybody was ordered to be staying at home. So there was a very sharp, abrupt change in terms of the pattern. Whereas if you look at the mobility in the retail sector, that's, how oftentimes you go to your local grocery shopping and how often do you go to your shopping malls and so on. People were kind of already voting on their feet as early as mid, to late February. People began to already reduce their visit to the HEBs or the grocery stores. And it's a gradual, slower, and much kind of a more gradual reduction of that mobility as compared to this sort of a top-down order-based decision making. So there was an interesting contrast between the two. And then to quantitatively formalize such analysis, we leverage this framework in Indian microeconomics literature pioneered by Nobel laureate Professor Christopher Sims, which is this the vector autoregression framework, which basically says if you have multiple interdependent time series, how do you sort of attribute each time series impact on that variable that you care about, in this case, electricity consumption. Okay? So basically the question is the following. I am interested in electricity consumption changes, and I am interested in different factor, how each different factor attribute to that change. For instance, mobility in the retail sector, for instance, public health, for instance, social distancing, so for instance, shutdown of commercial activities. So this gives us a very nice framework of understanding and quantifying that. And it's by its nature, all these are interdependent variables, right? So I'll just draw a quick figure here, which shows, when it comes to explaining the change of electricity, and we look at different factors, and it seems to be that the mobility in the retail sector is sort of emerging as the key influencing factor. Not COVID cases, by the way, not public health data, but rather this mobility in the retail sector seems to be the most direct and most influencing factor in explaining the changes on electricity consumption. And even for the major large cities like such as Houston, where Houston, unlike New York City, actually saw a much more mild overall demand reduction, perhaps just because of the spread out of the city, and there is not much of a concentration of the commercial zone as compared to New York. And but still, that mobility in the retail sector emerges as one of the key influencing factors. So that was sort of something interesting. And not only that, such a framework also can provide policymakers to address some of the what-if questions, right? So as we were, if you recall last summer, people were really debating about, should we open up, should we not open up? And unfortunately, even today, we're still discussing about that. So this kind of a framework actually allows you to ask a what-if question. So for example, what if I have 1% increase in daily new confirmed cases? How does that affect my electricity consumption in my region, and so on and so forth, right? So that becomes a effective policymaking assistance tool. So to summarize this part, as you could see, we sort of visualize and quantify the impact of COVID on the first part of the pandemic, and across the board there was significant changes in terms of electricity consumption, and among all the different domains of factors, the mobility in the retail sector seems to be a strong influencing contributor to that. And this cross-domain certainly was something we didn't learn in our textbooks. At least when we learned electricity market, we never thought about mobility or public health as one of the deciding factors. But COVID certainly have taught us something new. And then let's move on to the more recent event in February that is closer to my home. And this is the city of Houston. I guess, Rachel, you live there, right? So This is the again the NASA image on February 7th, and then just short 9 days after that, there was a very visible difference. And as power engineer, it was really saddened to see more than 200 people died, and more than 4.5 million homes and businesses in Texas were affected by this devastating power outage. And it was really a challenging moment. And, there are a lot of, this is a hotly charged issue, right? And all kinds of voices came after this, right? There were all kinds of finger pointing and, policy issues, politics, technology. What could we do as an energy research scientist? What could we do? We thought maybe what we could bring on the table is something more quantitative. It's something more data-driven, and that's exactly what we did. Many of you may or may not be aware that the energy grid is subject to the CEII, Confidential Energy Information Infrastructure, under the Energy Act of 2007. In other words, the transmission network is not publicly accessible for good reasons, for security reasons. But is there any way that, to the best that we can, that one could come up with synthetic yet realistic representation of a large complex network such as the Texas system, and then bring some reasoning about what happened and what could have been done differently, right? So in our community, there has been a big move towards the so-called synthetic grid models, in which you combine the value of some open accessible information such as generators and loads, and then you couple that with a synthetic network, which characteristically captures some of the key issues of the network, yet it is a synthetic, not a real grid. And it allows the broader research community to understand and to quantify various different factors that affect events, extreme events, such as the one we saw here, right? So that's exactly what we did. Again, it was many sleepless nights, but we thought we could offer something that is timely, so we did that together with Breakthrough Energy. And so I want to just show you some results. This is also just published by, Advances in Applied Energy just a couple of weeks ago. This again, it's about data. Here you can see that the estimated generation capacity, the actual online generation capacity, and actual load. So you could already see that things became really bad right after that Valentine's night. And there was a significant amount of generation outage on the morning of February the 15th. And generation output data from all sources, right? And I just want to kind of show you some sample data that we were able to find. This is the wind and solar generation in Texas. Again, this generation gets affected across the board, but just because of time limit, I'm just going to show you two types of generation output. So you can see solar and wind, the counterfactual that we created through this synthetic model were very much matching the actual all the way until prior to the event, right? So that gave us the confidence. And then the counterfactual basically was the one that having no such extreme events awareness, right? So in other words, what if there weren't for this winter outage, the black colored generation output would have been the actual output from the wind and solar. But because of this outage, they got turned to the red colored one. So there was a significant derating of both types of generation sources. And that happened across the board in many other technologies as well. So not only that, you can then begin to reason about some of the issues that has more sort of a power systems context, such as what exactly could have been done differently, right? So in order for answering that, you'd have to actually use optimal power flow, which is a optimization dispatch model to determine the amount of load shedding necessary to the grid operator. And this is the sort of the outage event. As you could see that the actual load shedding versus the simulated, based on the synthetic data, simulated load shedding are sort of as much as we could, highly correlated. And it closely matches the ERCOT meter data. Another very interesting and important factor is really about what could we learn from these lessons, right? So in other words, what are the possible corrective measures moving forward? So some of the corrective measures that we sort of outlined in one of the op-eds we published in the Houston Chronicle was that, winterization or connecting Texas with Eastern or Western demand response and strategic energy storage. But these are very high level points. Could we actually quantify that? And then we did exactly that in this paper. So I'm just going to show you, some of the key findings. These are, different scenarios that we studied using this open synthetic model. As you could see, by winterizing a 10, 20, or 30 gigawatts, the energy not served, which is a key measure of reliability, could have been improved by, as high as 600 gigawatt hour. And that's a major reduction in terms of the number of people affected by the outage. Another interesting point I want to bring to your attention is that energy storage is an important factor. But in order to have that kind of a scale and impact, it seems that energy storage alone would have not got us too far. You would have combined perhaps energy storage together with winterization. That would probably have the most sort of a bang for the buck. And to summarize, we developed this extendable and open model that is a synthetic grid based that could serve as a platform for the broader energy research community, by which I mean people like what we have today, to really understand extreme events such as the Texas power outage. And we can reproduce to the best that we could the detailed process of what had happened. And more importantly, we could begin to quantitatively analyze corrective measures on mitigating such extent of the power outage in the future. So my final thoughts are that the electricity sector is going to become a key enabler of any climate solutions, and significant research is needed to modernize the grid, in particular under extreme conditions. We sort of are making some headways towards an open, extendable, and data-driven approach to shed some light for both technical and policy perspectives in handling these extreme conditions. And this is really just the beginning of the journey, and we welcome you all to join these efforts to develop quantifiable data-driven models for extreme events analysis, such as carbon impact, such as cyber physical security, and many more. With that, I'm going to conclude my talk and be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Xie, for that really awesome presentation. And please submit questions, folks, into the Q&A or to the chat section. So I want to touch on this approach that you have shared with us today. It's a cross-domain framework, and for me, and the work that I do in resiliency and sustainability, I understand that the relationship of all sorts of other critical infrastructure sectors are really important, like the chemical and petrochemical industries, food and agriculture, communications, emergency services, transportation, municipal water and wastewater systems. All of those things, are cross-linked, and the winter storm cause not only a massive power outage, but also a loss of water and access to water, and really crippled our municipal water systems. I mean, a lot of the chemical and petrochemical facilities, the largest petrochemical complex really in the country and one of the largest ones in the world. I mean, it really affected their critical processes and it had ramifications that some of which are still seeing across the supply chain today. And so, I mean, I guess my question to you is, in relation to these other sectors and the water infrastructure. Any thoughts on this or future plans to capture the evolving dynamics of these other entities? How do we incorporate these sectors into forecasting and risk assessments when we look at this for more informed decision making?
Thank you. I think this is a wonderful question, and that's actually something we are exactly working on as we speak. We just got some NSF grants that actually focus on exactly extending this framework to include natural gas infrastructure. I mean, again, we were doing it step by step. We first, we were extending it from between electricity and natural gas because, as you exactly pointed out, a large piece of this whole Texas outage was due to the unavailability of natural gas supply and distribution. So we need to look into this cross-coupling between these two infrastructure systems. And then again, as you very well pointed, it also has a lot of implication as far as water is concerned. So I think this is actually something I'm very, very excited about is that different communities that we used to kind of don't talk to each other very much, but now we are beginning to talk to each other. And I actually have a student who is now in Houston working for some of the natural gas companies, and he is providing all kinds of information about natural gas infrastructure. And we were beginning to combine them together, making it an open and cross-domain approach so that these cross dependencies, interdependency could be better analyzed and better studied when the next extreme event hit us, which may not be too long from today.
That's good. I think for effective risk management, it really depends on evaluating all of those cross-sector risks into the critical infrastructure picture, and it will help us, engage across all of these entities to facilitate a shared understanding of risk. And so I think that's great that you're doing that. So the other thing that I wanted to acknowledge here and to bring up is the connectivity and the symbiotic nature between sustainability, what this session is about, and resilience, right? Resiliency planning through different forms of risk mitigation, whether that's engineering controls, policy interventions, analytical forecasting tools, stakeholder engagement, all of those things can help enable a more sustainable system. And sustainability, whether in resiliency, whether that's at the technology level or process level or systems level, but that linkage is really important. So the whole idea of resilience is a concern in energy supply chains that have been stressed by all of these different weather events along the Gulf Coast and stressed even further by COVID. It disrupted markets, it elevated chemical feedstock prices, which were already at all-time highs before this multi-day freeze. And that, along with COVID, really impacted things even further. So how does your open source approach and range of research feed into resiliency planning and sustainability policies? As we look at that both from an enterprise level and a government policymaking level.
That's a great question, and I think that's really, ultimately the goal of such approach, right? I mean, we like data, but we want data to be somehow useful, and that's exactly what you're alluding to. Is that how could this data be useful? Is that they could be useful when it comes to planning for resiliency and sustainability, both for enterprise and for government agency level. Now, let me give you some concrete examples. Some of you may or may not know that the natural gas infrastructure, for example, in the state of Texas, is largely governed by the Railroad Commission in Texas, whereas the electricity infrastructure is largely regulated and governed by the Public Utility Commission of Texas. And these two commissioners these two commissions are literally in different offices in Austin, and they don't necessarily have that much of a interaction or you know, concerted efforts as always, right? So such open and cross-domain data becomes a very natural linkage of different agencies, such as the two I just mentioned, so that when it comes to the next extreme events, the railroad commissions and the public utility commissions of Texas could begin to reason together and analyze that using this common framework and prepare what's best in terms of resiliency, not from an individual infrastructure perspective, but hopefully from a more holistic infrastructure perspective, right?
Very good, very good. And I know we're out of time here, but I'm curious, the current project that you presented today, you know, that seems to be an ongoing effort. Are you continuing to look at how the other emerging COVID variants like Delta, Lambda are creating vulnerabilities in the energy system and the economy? Is that something that is a part of your ongoing research?
We are still collecting data as we speak. We saw a major kind of a rebound in terms of energy consumption after the first wave. Now, the paper we published was more on the short run impact. In terms of the medium run impact and so on, we're still analyzing that. We'll definitely make them available as soon as the results become ready.
Okay. Well, Professor Xie, thank you so much for your presentation. I don't see any other questions that populated in the chat and the Q&A, but this entire session has been really informative. And I want to thank all of our panelists, Holger, Stephanie, Destiny, and Lei, for all of your insights. And I think for me, the key takeaway here, and I think that the takeaway that I'd like our audience to have is recognizing sustainability as a strategic priority and looking at that from the systems level with consideration of all of the different social, environmental, economic elements, you know, across the life cycle throughout the entire value chain, some of which we touched on today. So thank you everybody for attending. And